In Grandma's Attic by Arleta Richardson. Illustrated by Dora. Chapter 11. Nellie's Trips to Town. The rain was splashing down and I was bored. "Grandma," I said, "what did you do to have fun when you were a little girl?" "Oh my," said Grandma. "There was lots to do on the farm. We had a swing in the big tree. We played in the barn loft when it rained. We waded in the brook and picked berries and nuts. There was always something to keep us busy." "Didn't you ever go away on any trips?" I asked. "Did you have to stay on the farm all the time?" "We went to church on Sunday," said Grandma, "and sometimes we went to town with Ma and Pa for the day. That was a big treat." Grandma worked on her crocheting a few moments. Then she chuckled and said, "I remember one trip to town that had a funny ending. Run and get me another ball of thread and I'll tell you about it." I hurried back with the thread and Grandma began the story. It was a Friday, I remember. Pa had several errands in town and Ma wanted to do some shopping, so it was decided that the whole family would go and make a day of it. The boys hurried through their chores while Ma and I packed a lunch to take along. We were soon ready and on our way. I went with Ma to pick out dress goods and other things she needed, and the boys went with Pa. We were to meet at the buggy later in the afternoon to get our lunch. We were going to picnic in the little grove at the edge of town. Pa tied Nellie to the hitching post near the blacksmith's shop, and we all went our separate ways. Ma and I took a long time picking out material and buttons and thread. Of course, there were other things to look at, too. By the time we got back to the blacksmith's shop, Pa and the boys were already there. Pa was looking up the road with a puzzled expression, and the boys were running around the back of the shop. Nellie and the buggy were nowhere to be seen. Ma wasted no time in coming to the point. "Pa," she said, "where is Nellie?" "I don't just know," Pa replied, "but she doesn't appear to be here." "Did you tie her tight?" Ma asked. "Couldn't she have flipped the reins off the post and gone on home?" "That's not likely," said Pa. "I'm sure I tied her as tight as usual. There must be some explanation for this." "Well," said Ma, "I wish you'd find it in a hurry. Our lunch is in the buggy and it's getting late." "Yes, Pa," I said. "I'm hungry." "We'll find Nellie all right," said Pa. "Don't worry. I'll ask around and see if anyone saw her start away." No one had. The blacksmith had noticed several buggies come and go, but he couldn't say who was in them. There were still several horses tied there, but none of them was Nellie. Anyone who had noticed a horse pulling an empty buggy would surely have stopped it. Evening was coming on and we children were getting hungrier. Ma was getting more worried and Pa had exhausted all the possibilities he could think of. At last he suggested that we go to the minister's house to rest and decide what to do. The minister's wife was surprised to see us, but very hospitable. "Why, of course you'll stay here," she said when she had heard the story. "And after supper Will can take you out to your place. I'm sure your horse must have gone on home." We were glad she had mentioned supper. The thought of the long ride home with nothing to eat was not a pleasant one for us children. The women began to prepare the meal, and Pa and the minister discussed our problem. There was never any thought that Nellie had been stolen. People just didn't steal horses and buggies in our little town. Perhaps some mischievous boys had untied the horse, but even that didn't seem likely with people around all the time. There seemed to be nothing more to do about it that night, so after supper the minister hitched up his buggy and we got in for our trip home. It was dark now, and only a few people were left on the street. Lights shone from the blacksmith shop, however, and as we approached it, Roy called out, "Look, Pa, there's Nellie right where we left her." The minister stopped the horse and Pa jumped down. Sure enough, there was Nellie in the buggy. Pa walked around and looked at the horse in disbelief. Nellie looked back at him as if to say, "Well, where have you been? Don't you know it's dark?" By this time, the rest of us were gathered around. The lunch still sat in the buggy, untouched. We were too astonished to speak. Finally, Pa said, "I guess we might as well go home. She's not going to tell us where she's been." He thanked the minister for his help, and we climbed into our own buggy. The trip home was spent trying to find a reasonable explanation for what had happened. We could think of none. Pa was just glad to have the horse and buggy back and be on our way home. Saturday morning we were still talking about the mystery when our neighbor, Ed Hobbs, drove into the yard. Pa went out to meet him and invited him in to breakfast. "Thanks," said Ed, "but I've already eaten. I just came to tell you folks what happened yesterday." He sat down at the table and told us the story. "I was pretty busy yesterday," he said, "and I had a broken plow that needed to be fixed. I couldn't spare my boy to take it into town, so Grandpa said he'd do it for me. Grandpa's getting pretty old and doesn't see very well, but I thought he could probably make it to the blacksmith shop all right, so I loaded the plow in the buggy and Grandpa started out. It wasn't until early evening, long after Grandpa had returned, that I noticed a strange horse in the barn. Then I saw the buggy out beside the shed. I went into the house to see who was visiting. Grandpa was dozing by the fire, and there was no one else in the kitchen but the family." "Grandpa," I said, "whose horse is in the barn?" "Why, it's our horse, naturally," said Grandpa. "Whose did you think it was?" "That's not our horse, Grandpa," I said. "It looks like Brother Odell's horse and buggy to me." "Brother Odell?" said Grandpa. "Is Brother Odell here? Why didn't he come in and sit a spell?" "No, Grandpa," I replied. "Brother Odell isn't here. I think you brought his horse and buggy home." "Now, why would I do a thing like that?" asked Grandpa indignantly. "I wasn't anywhere near the Odell's place today." "I gave up on Grandpa," said Ed. "I hitched up your horse and drove it into town. There was our horse and buggy right in front of the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith said you'd been looking for your horse, but he didn't know where you'd gone. So I tied her up and came on home. I figured I'd come and tell you about it first thing this morning. I'm sorry about Grandpa. I won't send him on any more errands into town." Pa laughed as hard as we children did. He assured Ed that everything had turned out all right, and Grandpa Hobbs was forgiven. We seldom made a trip to town after that, but someone would say, "Remember when Grandpa Hobbs took Nellie home by mistake?" I guess that was the most memorable trip to town we had when I was a little girl. Grandma continued to rock and crochet, and I returned to the window to watch the rain and think what fun it would have been to be a little girl when Grandma was. End of chapter 11.